The 12th Thabo Mbeki Africa Lecture is a joint initiative of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and Unisa. And this year, the theme is the African Union at 20. Max Boqwana is from the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and joins me now. Max, good evening and welcome to you. 2022 marking 20 years since the establishment of the African Union and 70 years for the Organization of African Unity from which it sprung. And you've lined up an exciting speaker again this year, Professor Toyin Falola, who has written extensively on a range of subjects, including knowledge production. Your hope is that his lecture inspires honest dialogue about the state of our continent and the AU. What can we expect to hear?
Indeed, Iman, thank you very much for having us, and evening to your viewers. You will recall that I think the main issue for us is to examine the constitutive act of the AU, which started dealing with the issues of good governance, the issues of peace and security in the continent, the issues of economic development, the issues of justice, and the area of ECOSOC, which need to involve non-state actors in the work of the AU. So Professor Falola, we expect him to shine a spotlight on how far have we succeeded in implementing all of these positions that were put in Durban in the summit almost 20 years ago.
A key clue in what shapes my expectations of this lecture would be the word honest, an honest appraisal of where Africa is. And if we hark back to what Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi was saying about the sluggishness of implementation or where things get stuck, even though we have the best laid plans to take us in a direction of change and growth. What could we expect in terms of that honest characterization so that we could move forward credibly with the areas of work that we need to accomplish on the continent?
You're correct, man. If you look at the fact that we are 2 years later in terms of silencing the guns, and we're beginning to see a number of coups that are taking place, whether we're talking about Mali, Guinea-Bissau, the continued conflict in Ethiopia and Tigray, and even in our neighborhood in Swaziland, that gives an indication of the inability somehow of the AU to deal with these issues of insecurity. You will recall that during the time we are talking about, one of the greatest blight is the whole issue of Libya, which today still remains in huge crisis. So we need to make an honest examination about our ability and inability as Africans to be able to deal with these issues. But secondly, it's important that the Africans themselves need to be in a position to develop a sovereign African program upon which they can be able to engage the rest of the world with. It's still problematic to find that we as Africans keep on being invited in various parts of the world. And when the world seems to have a clear plan about Africa, and we need as Africans to have a clear plan about ourselves, and how does that plan relate to what is happening in the rest of the world? And you will also realize that the issues of conflict has undermined development and economic prosperity of our continent. And I think we need to examine all of these issues in detail.
One almost wants to say what then, but I'm going to park the what then question just for a moment, because that kind of hinges or pivots on how the African Union is enabled to derive accountability or to create accountability in African governments that are standing in the way of progress, but also in which these coups and this dysfunction is happening. But if there's time, I'll get back there. But the African Union is able to do its work through a series of ways. And the one is to almost devolve the responsibility for certain things to the agencies that fall under its ambit. The African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, is meant to be the catalyst for the types of economic and infrastructure development we need. Now, how well would you say they are working to accelerate some of the objectives that we talked about, certainly on the economic front?
you know, amongst all of the difficulties that were faced, Iman, you will realize that the African free trade area has now been consummated, and it's one economic program that needs to be supported. And as we were saying earlier on, even at a technical level, we still have some of our fellow South Africans that are part of that. So to some extent, there is progress in that regard. But I think what will be the proof is to what extent are we going to be able to deal with the imbalances in terms of the levels of development and industrialization. You will realize that even when we talk about the signatories of the Africa Free Trade Area, the big giants, economic giants in the continent, South Africa and Nigeria, were the last one to come on board. And it was not out of malice, but this issue of the balance in terms of economic trade. So I think the fact that we are still talking about these agencies today, we're able to reflect on their weaknesses and failures in the past, but with some successes, it spells a very, very good prospects for our continent. That's why from us as a foundation and Unisa, we want to continue to shine the spotlight on these issues, especially to pose challenge to our intellectuals to be able to deal with these things and ensure a better Africa.
Well, if your intention was to whet our appetites, I can say my appetite's been whetted, if that's the correct term. Thank you very much, Max Boqwana, for sharing with us the subject matter for the upcoming Thabo Mbeki lecture.